Hi, it's Friday and time to look back at what happened this week at Queen's Park. The legislature was supposed to be in recess, but it was brought back on Thursday and will be sitting over this weekend. And the government will be making use of this sitting to pass a historic legislation which uses the Charter of Rights and Freedoms Notwithstanding clause to pass an election finance law, laws that were struck down by the Ontario Superior Court for being unconstitutional. Today is the first day of step one in Ontario's reopening from the pandemic. This past week there was a province-wide revulsion and reaction to the murder of a family for being Muslim. I want to introduce Ontario's Anti-Racism Directorate in case you haven't heard about it. The Science Table reported this week about education and its impact by the impact of the pandemic on education, and the fact that kids will need help with education recovery in the fall. And finally, the question of election finance. There's a balance between the need to protect democratic elections from the corruption of money, spending money, or the appearance of corruption on the one hand, and free speech on the other hand. And the question is whether Premier Ford should be using our constitutional notwithstanding clause to legislate where that balance should be. Keep watching to find out more. Otherwise, join me next week as I talk about what happened at Queen's Park. So today is the first day of step one of the reopening plan in Ontario. So restaurant patios will be allowed to open. There will be overnight camping. Groups of 10 people will be able to gather outdoors with masking and distancing. And non-essential retail will be able to open with a maximum of 15% of capacity. This week there was a broad outpouring of statements and sympathy across Ontario in the wake of the murder of a family in London, Ontario, for being Muslim. The legislature being back, there was an opposition motion from MPP Mitzi Hunter calling on the Anti-Racism Directorate to take action. I just want to introduce that. It is a part of the Ontario government which has the mandate to work on racism. And given that there are administrative things that can be done, there are social things, technological things, education, there's a lot of different things that could be done. It may be a good idea to take the anti-racism back out of the Solicitor General's silo where it was put by Premier Ford's government and allow it to work more broadly and perhaps report directly to Cabinet or to the Premier's office. The Science Table reported this week on the disruption of education, how it hit low-income and racialized groups more than others. Extra funding will be needed for an education recovery, and some intensive learning programs will be needed for the most affected. Kids will need more attention this fall. And finally, election finance. There was a bill, Bill 254, that was passed earlier this spring, and one of the parts of that bill took the 6 month, the restriction on spending in the 6 months before an election. So third-party groups could spend $600,000 in the 6 months before an election, and that period was extended to 12 months, and the same amount of money, $600,000. And the idea is to protect elections from the corruption of large amounts of money. But on the flip side, you are restricting free speech potentially when you do that. So there has to be a balance somewhere. In the United States, there was a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United, which essentially removed any restrictions on spending in elections on the basis of free speech. And that's led to a lot of problems, including, I would say, having an impact on the world's response to climate change. Here in Canada, things are a little bit different. In our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you can, if you want to achieve some social good, you can restrict rights and freedoms, but you have to do it in a way that you have the smallest possible limit on rights and freedoms in order to achieve a particular social good. The government of Ontario did not explain why they needed to expand the 6-month period to 12 months. And in fact, their own experts said, well, 6 months is okay, 12 months is okay. So it was pretty clear to the judge that 12 months was in no way a minimal impact on free speech, because 6 months was okay. And so that's in fact section 1 of the charter, that principle, where that principle comes from. So the judge said, okay, I'm going to strike down those parts of the Election Finance Act that had the 12 months in it, that was put in there by the legislation passed this spring. Now, we couldn't leave that situation as it was, because there would be no restrictions on spending by third parties. And for example, there was a piece that was struck down that said you can't get money from foreign sources. But Premier Ford could have just gone back to the original 6-month period. The judge's ruling did not address whether or not that 6-month restriction, with all the things connected with it, like no money from foreign sources and no collusion. The judge did not say whether that 6-month period was a minimal limitation on free speech. That's a question still to be answered. But instead, the Premier Ford wanted to keep that 12-month limit. And there's a political reason for that, which is in the short term, the government is likely to have more spending by groups opposed to it. Well, the Progressive Conservative Party is going to have more spending by groups opposed to it than in favor of it. So there was a short-term gain from the Progressive Conservative government and its re-election efforts. And the problem is the notwithstanding clause is only supposed to be used in really rare circumstances. It was put in at the last minute as a compromise so that all the provinces could agree on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it was expected that this would only be used in extreme circumstances where there was some question that had to be addressed by a legislature to overruling the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it had to be kind of on the same level of importance as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the problem with invoking the notwithstanding clause is that if you invoke it for a reason that's not that important, and it's pretty clear that it's being used to make it easier in the next election campaign, you end up eroding people's rights and freedoms if you use the notwithstanding clause too much. Because if your right can be taken away, it's not a right. So it's really, really important to be careful about using the notwithstanding clause. So the use of it this time sets a really dangerous precedent. I think this whole issue requires a longer discussion, a lot more time than I have right now. So I'll probably write a blog or tape a longer video. If you like these videos, please follow me on social media. And if you have any comments, please put them below. And join me next week as I look back at what happened at Queen's Park.